I was reading in a new book that I got on spiritual formation recently, and the author was talking about the first time he went to the Grand Canyon. And he said he walked right up to the very edge of it and was immediately struck with a feeling of smallness and awe. At the depth, some places more than a mile, the river that ran through at the bottom, the rock formations, the sheer size of it and how it's so far to the other side. And he said, I don't see how anybody could ever be in anything but awe when they stared into that abyss that is the Grand Canyon. But then he said something else. He said, I took a few steps backwards, a few feet backwards, and when I looked again, I no longer saw the canyon. All he could see was the land in front of him and the land on the other side, and it looked like a horizon, and everything was the same. Standing a few feet back, you could not see that giant hole, that giant canyon. And he said that stuck with him, and I thought it was a good image, a good metaphor or analogy to use for what he was talking about in spiritual formation. But I thought it was also good for another lesson, a lesson that we had this morning in the text that we read from Mark's Gospel. Basically, what it means is this. Just like standing before the Grand Canyon, right at the very edge, looking at all the glory and beauty and power that's associated with that, could not do anything, it seems to me, but give you a sense of awe. And stepping a few feet back, you wouldn't have that sense. The same is true in our faith. The closer to Jesus we stand, the more awe, the more peace, the more contentment, the more tranquility we're going to have. Take a few steps back, and it goes away. And in comes doubt, fear, anxiousness, uncertainty, and anything but a peace that surpasses understanding. So you get that. It makes sense. The closer we are to Jesus, the closer we are to Him, the more awe, the more peace that surpasses understanding we're going to have. Step back from that, and it won't be long before it's all gone. And in the place of that peace that surpasses understanding comes fear that makes many of us live lives full of fear, of anxiousness, of despair, of worry. Not being certain about who has us in the palm of His hand, who carries us with Him. Take a few steps back, and it's easy for it to be gone until you're ready to come back up to the precipice and draw close to Jesus once again. This story to me is pretty amazing. It's one we're mostly familiar with. I don't remember the first time I heard it, but I'm sure I heard it very, very early on in Sunday school. The story about Jesus being asleep in the boat, down below deck, snoozing away, not a care in the world, not worried about anything. And the disciples up top, growing more afraid by the moment. Many of them were experienced fishermen. They knew the Sea of Galilee. They made their living from it. You could understand those that were landlubbers, so to speak, that maybe hadn't been on a boat that much, being a little bit of afraid when a storm came up. But those that were experienced fishermen should have understood. One thing they did understand is that the Sea of Galilee can become tumultuous in a moment's time. That storms can come over from the Transjordan and blow down from the ridge, and the water will become huge. The waves will be big enough to scuttle the boat. The wind fierce enough that your boat won't go. Now, I don't know how big exactly their fishing boat was. It was bigger than a bass tracker, but it certainly wasn't a cruise ship. It was big enough for several of them to be on it and to cast nets to the other side and bring in a haul of fish. That's how they made their living. But it wasn't so big that it couldn't be lost at sea. I remember many, many years ago, I had a pontoon boat. And myself and my son and a couple of friends, we took off to Sardis Lake down in Mississippi. And we parked at the dam and put the boat in, and then went almost all the way to the back of the lake. We're talking about 15 to 20 miles. And if you know anything about Sardis Lake, you know, just like the Sea of Galilee, a storm can come up all of a sudden. And that storm came up, and those waves began to chop, and you could see the white caps on them, and we decided that we better make it back to the boat dock before it got any worse. By the time we got back, those waves were 3 and 4 feet high, and it was like riding a washboard, every second hitting another wave with that pontoon. And there were a couple of times I wondered, should I put my life jacket on? Am I going to sink? But we didn't. We got back, and I said, I'll never do that again. I won't go out that far on Sardis Lake without being able to get back to the boat dock. And I didn't. The disciples, even those that were experienced, especially those, I guess, who were experienced, that they really understood what this could mean. If the boat was overcome by the wind and water and scuttled, they would all die. I don't care how good a swimmer you are, you're probably not likely to be able to swim out of the middle of the Sea of Galilee during a storm. There were no life jackets back then like we have today. They would have been in trouble. And so they grew afraid. And in growing afraid, they sort of became a little bit miffed or maybe a little bit angry with Jesus. How could Jesus just be under the deck, sleeping in the stern of the boat on a nice cushion, snoozing away while we're up here doing all the suffering? So they wake him up. And what do? They did what most people would do, I suppose. They said, do you not even care that we're dying up here? Maybe that was a little bit of an exaggeration, but they were afraid. Don't you care what's happening to us right now? And Jesus speaks and stills the storm. And right in that moment, they have that experience of awe. Who is this that even the wind and the storm obey him? But should they have even had to have that thought? Think about it. Now, when this story is told, it's probably within the first year of Jesus' ministry, and the disciples have been with him. They haven't been with him terribly long. They followed him from town to town. They did what he asked them to do. And they had seen some things that were just amazing. They had seen Jesus heal people. They had seen Jesus heal a boy who was let down through the roof of the gathering place where they were and telling him to take up his cot and walk home. They had seen Jesus casting out demons. They had seen him talking to people who were spiritually possessed and commanding that they be set free, and they were. They had seen him argue with people like the Pharisees and the scribes, whose rules were so bitter, heavy, and harsh on the average person. They saw Jesus argue with them and put them in their place and show that he understood more than they understood. They had witnessed all that. And in the very first time that something troublesome comes up, the storm on the Sea of Galilee, they bring Jesus out and say, don't you even care that we're about to die? And I've wondered often, I don't know if you have, I've wondered often, how could they witness all the things that they saw and still be able to step back from that faith that gives them awe and helps them to understand glory and the peace that surpasses understanding? If this were the only story like this, it wouldn't maybe be so bad, but you see it time and time and time again in the life of the disciples, those who were closest to Jesus. They never understood. Not until after Easter, Jesus explained it to them. They didn't understand. They had their own notions about how things were supposed to go, And if that didn't mesh with Jesus's, they wanted theirs to still be the way things went. Not the only story in the Bible either. Remember back to the children of the Exodus. The story that gets told is how God rescued this people from slavery and took them out across the wilderness through Moses and promised them that they would be in a land flowing with milk and honey, except they ruined it for themselves. Anytime a hardship came up, they would say to Moses, it would have been better if you had left us as slaves in Egypt than to come out here and starve to death, than to come out here and die of thirst, than to come out here and face difficulties of different kinds that we weren't prepared to face. And every time God delivered them, you would think that finally they would stand at that precipice and see God in the way that we should see God, to have that sense of awe and trust, to understand that this God who has brought us along is not going to leave us behind, to look out and have that experience of grace that can only make you feel overwhelmed and give you a peace deep down on the inside. But they didn't do that, did they? They stepped back every single time and could no longer see what they needed to see. And I thought, aren't we like that? Maybe the reason the biblical character's story is so compelling for us today is because we're not any different than they were. Think about your own life. Think about those times when you get really stirred up about something. It could be anger. It could be fear. It could be anxiety. It may be illness. It could be anything in your life that causes you to take a step back so that you can no longer see the God who has led you thus far. And in doing that, we're just like the disciples. Master, don't you care that we're about to die? And Jesus coming and giving to them what they needed, saying, peace, be still. And the storm went away. The truth of the matter is, the closer we draw to Jesus, the closer you and I draw to Jesus, the more awe we ought to experience. The more sense of holiness we ought to have. The more faith we should exhibit. The more peace we should have inside us. So that things that are out there won't detract us anymore. But it's up to us to stand on the precipice and look out, to have that awe. Jesus will never compel it. If you stand there and look, you will have that peace that you so crave. You will have that sense of protection. You will have that notion that God really does love me and will never, ever, ever leave me. Take a step back, and it can go so quickly. Let's not be like that writer that stood on the edge of the Grand Canyon and then took steps back so that he could no longer see what a moment ago gave him so much of a sense of awe. The closer we draw to Jesus, the more we model our lives after him, the more like him we will be. The more peace we're going to have. The less stress, the less anxiousness we'll have, and we will have that sense of peace that passes understanding. Where are you this morning? Are you standing on the precipice? Or have you taken a step back? In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, amen.